And so I'm just so excited to be able to speak to a live composer about their work. And also, I want to get to know you a little bit better. So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself first?
Well, I've been doing music my whole life. I can't remember a time when I wasn't. And I first got my first guitar when I was 8 years old and strummed folk tunes for a couple of years, and then heard Bach and decided I wanted to be a classical guitar player. So I switched to that, went to the San Francisco Conservatory as a performance major. And John Adams was teaching composition there at that time. It was his only day gig, the famous American composer.
Right.
And so I took a workshop because I had already been writing pieces on the sly for guitar, just writing down what I heard and what I wanted to play. And so I was interested in writing music. And I took the workshop. And at the end of the workshop, John Adams said, "Well, you're good at this. You should maybe take the seminar
Wow.
where you will start writing your own pieces." And so I did, and within a year, I had decided that the performance career really wasn't of much interest to me, and that I really was interested in writing music. And so by the age of 20, I had decided to dedicate myself to writing. And so I returned to UBC to finish an undergrad degree, and then I went and got my master's and doctorate from McGill. And I guess the rest is history. I've been writing music on commission ever since I was in my master's program at
Right.
McGill.
Right. And I was reading through your bio, and it's so impressive. You've won so many awards and you've written so many pieces. It's very varied too. It's not just like one style, but you write electroacoustic music as well,
Yeah.
and chamber music, orchestral music, choral music. It's like everything.
Well, music is huge, and for me, music expresses not just me, but like humanity. I just, in ancient times, they would say the music flowed through you or was a gift from God, and so on and so forth. I kind of believe that composers are somewhat a vessel through which music flows. And I also, since a very early age, have kind of a humanist philosophy. It's transformed into what I now call a omnicultural approach,
Hmm.
which we can talk about as we go along, talking about the pieces that mix cultures together, especially Chinese and Western.
Right.
And so that's why my interests are always I'm always very curious about as many different ways of making music as possible. And so I've written opera, written for orchestra, and lots of chamber music, and then music with interactive computer and electronics. Very early on, I was interested in electronic music as well. So I have a rather broad experience, let's say.
It's quite amazing.
Yeah, it was lots of fun.
So, what led you to start writing for Chinese instruments is what I'm curious about.
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that I was born and raised in Vancouver.
Hmm.
And although I spent my education years, only a couple of years in Vancouver, I started out in San Francisco, a couple of years in Vancouver at UBC, and then off to Montreal, where I got quite an exposure to French music, Quebec music, international music, and did a bit of traveling in my late 20s and early 30s. I decided to settle back in Vancouver, and when I returned in the early 1990s, I had discovered that the culture was a lot more mixed than it had been when I was growing up. I grew up in the late 70s in Vancouver. That's when I went to high school, and I started to see that musicians from various different musical backgrounds were working together and mixing things up. People were doing free improvised music. They were mixing different cultures and doing what I call world jam, where you essentially come with your own traditional practice and mix it up with somebody else's. And I found that all fascinating. And so around 2004, I was talking with Randy Rain Rouge and his wife Han Mei, and started to get involved with her, and she commissioned a piece for Guzheng and string quartet
Hmm.
called The Lotus Bud, which has become a fairly well-known piece in China, Taiwan, and she, of course, made the first recording
Hmm.
of the piece, which is still available. No other recording has been made, but several players have played it in Shanghai and Taiwan, and I think Beijing as well. So it all started there, and it started rooted in that piece, I would say, where I was studying a lot of music for the zheng, and I actually took the rather well known for zheng players anyway, Pink Lotus in Many Modes, and I took the piece as the skeleton for my piece,
Right.
and I kind of amplified it. I actually left the original score in place for the zheng and surrounded it by string quartet, and that
Oh,
completely transforms the
wow.
sound of the piece.
Right.
So it began there with rather a major work, and then May and I worked together, and I wrote some duos for classical guitar and zheng, and then the commissions started almost right away. As soon as that piece was quite strong, and so the BC Chinese Music Association director Bill Lai commissioned a piece from me in 2005. It was the second major work I wrote for Chinese and Western instruments, and that was Eagle Flies to Mountain.
Right. And
So
it's a challenging work too.
yeah, and it has challenges because it's right from the get-go. The music I'm writing is I'm not tailoring it to a cultural group.
Hmm.
Even if I'm really interested in the sound of the instruments, the traditional instruments of China,
Right.
I'm not trying to write Chinese music.
Right.
Right? I couldn't do that anyway. I really think that people's experience of culture depends on so many factors. We appreciate music and art and all sorts of manifestations of the human spirit
Right.
in different ways depending on our own background. The best example I can give is, and it's because I believe language has a lot to do with how we perceive anything, especially music, though. I think music and the rhythm of music and the contour of melodic lines and so on are quite intertwined with the language of the culture that it comes from.
Hmm.
And that's to do with how the rhythm of the music goes mainly. And if you look at music and language and look how they go together, you can see how that works. So one of the things that makes what I do omnicultural is that I don't use a lot of notes. I don't use all 12 notes of the equal tempered scale, for example. I frequently just limit it to 5 to 7 notes. When I was in Paris, I was studying perception and how people perceive sequences of things, visual and sonic. And the magic number 5 plus or minus 2 is something that all humans share. That's about our limits of perception, is give us 3 to 7 things. We're going to remember first things, we're going to remember last things, and we can't remember long sequences of things.
Right.
When they get too long, we only remember first things and last things, which is why you got to have a great opening to a piece and a great ending to a piece, right?
That's right.
Okay, so I'm really interested in communicating with humanity, and so I'm going to write music that takes into consideration what the bulk of humanity experiences when they experience music. So I don't write specialist music.
Hmm.
That said, I really like invention.
Hmm.
I like the inventive mind. So I keep the notes simple enough so that the other areas that I explore, which is usually rhythmic, that's where I really am pushing the musician out of their comfort zone often enough, let's say.
Right.
So, for example, I grew up listening to a lot of jazz, a mixture of jazz, folk music, and classical music. Uh, Not much in the way of world music. I remember there was some Middle Eastern stuff that was popular in the 70s that my parents were listening to, kind of, Egyptian pop music or something like that. There was a little bit of that in there. Certainly, there was no Chinese music when I was growing up. I didn't
Oh.
hear. So musicians who play, what ends up happening is that if you are a purist musician who only likes one culture's music, then you're probably not a good candidate to perform my music. because the kind of musician who's going to do well performing my music is going to be somebody who is more interested in multiple traditions
Right.
and has explored other types of music. Jazz being one of them. Even though I'm not a jazz musician, I've never really written jazz per se in that tradition. Haven't studied at a school or anything. I have no legit background. It's a funny term to use because jazzers always say classical is legit, but I have no cred for jazz.
Uh-huh.
But the rhythm in the music that I write frequently calls upon the kind of experience that you get when you have internalized some jazz, and especially with rhythmic acuity, like rhythmic precision, and the ability to hold a rhythm down when other rhythms, cross rhythms and polyrhythms are happening. So that's really an important thing in my music. So that's where the concept of omniculture begins. And the notion is that the experience of the person who would play my music has got to be someone who's experienced with more than one type of music or more than one culture. You really have to have that kind of broader, curious mind to do it.
Right.
So that's how we get to Eagle Flies.
Well, I was listening to it many times over because like I found that every time that I listen to it, I hear something new. Like there's another layer that I had not heard before, and I found that it's very beautiful too. As you said, you can only remember certain number of notes or the melodic line, and it's true. Like just parts of it just stand out, and I keep remembering those few notes. It's a wonderful piece. But what inspired you to write this piece?
Well, I'm always inspired by the actual instruments that I've been asked to write for. I'm not an abstract composer in that sense. I like thought, I like concepts, but I don't write at a piano and then orchestrate. I've never done that. I get to know the instruments that I'm writing for, all of them. I study the instruments, I borrow the instruments. I really want to know what makes the instrument tick. And I did that with Purple Lotus Bud. I borrowed a jung. I tried to play it as best I could. And because I was dealing in that piece with an interface between pentatonic and let's call it the dominant seventh chord, one of the key sounds in Western music, which is supposed to resolve in Western music, but I'm using it in just intonation so that it doesn't resolve. It just sits there as a suspension. And that's what happens in the opening section of Purple Lotus Bud. And so one of the inventions I did for Jung, May told me that she'd never done this before, is what's called a 3-string bend, where you stick 3 fingers on 3 adjacent strings, and you move your hand in such a way that the pitch of this triad, 3 notes, changes. And of course, triadic thinking is typically Western and not typically Chinese.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is in that piece, the jung is going to play from a diminished chord to a dominant 7th chord by bending their hand. And that's a concept that a Western composer is going to come up with, maybe, before a Chinese composer, maybe. But these days, culture is all mixed up, so it might go the other way. But, it's something that I brought to it as a untrained composer who was just experimenting with the instrument. So experimenting with the instrument and getting to know how it ticks as best as I can is one of the important starting points. That said, it took me, Eagle Flies was my second piece. And I originally wrote, I thought it would work for, the clarinet part was originally written for suona and guanzi.
Oh.
Didn't work. Absolutely did not work. The suona just completely wiped out the ensemble. Right. It was just, the part was too fast. Yep. The part was too fast, and the result would have been too loud and too unwieldy because the intonation just simply wouldn't have worked.
Right.
I miscalculated.
Oh.
And so after the first performance where John Siwoo here played the part, I realized, oh, that was a big mistake. And so I made it for a clarinet, and it works perfectly with
It
clarinet.
does. Yes, the balance is just perfect.
Absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
And so, that was an interesting discovery. Is that, and it reinforced my notion that you really have to know the instrument and its repertoire, and how that instrument works in its native context before you can start mixing it up with other instruments.
Right.
So that's how it became a piece that could be done with clarinet. And then I realized that it could be more, the instrumentation could be a little more flexible by replacing sheng with accordion.
Hmm.
So in the second performance, Amy Stephen in Vancouver played accordion,
Oh,
and that was done for the Vancouver Intercultural Orchestra. And that worked in a different way. It sounded different.
right.
But one of the things I realize is that even though I'm sort of halfway there to a Chinese concept where you just have a tune and everybody plays the tune on their instrument idiomatically to create a kind of, homophony where it's sort of all basically the tune and you've sort of got a bit of harmony, sort of. I'm still a Western composer insofar as I'm still interested in harmony, and especially interested in polyphony. And so one of the things that happens in Eagle Flies is that I reinforce the notion of simple motives, but I do so using canonic procedures and augmentation and diminution, which are commonly used in fugue and canon techniques. So there's a section, this is why the 3/4 rhythm in the piece is so important, because I have the music, the simple motive, moving at different speeds, basically.
Hmm.
And for me, this is a metaphor also for the ages, young people moving fast, older people moving slower.
Hmm.
So it has to do with kind of integrating the ages and the generations of mankind as well. So there are all these kind of societal metaphors in the piece, and that's why I connected up conceptually with a specific slant on horoscope and the elements and ancient Chinese notions of the elements and so on, to connect it to culture. But in the end, it's all about the notes
Right.
actually as well. So, I'm not ever painting a picture the way Chinese music often implies a picture, or the title is about a specific
Hmm.
subject, and the music seems to be quite narrative.
Right.
Um, that's a tradition in China.
Yep.
I still think that the pieces themselves are still about the notes,
Hmm.
really.
Hmm.
But it's a tradition in China to paint a picture for the audience so that they have a way in and so that they remember the piece.
Right.
But do those combinations of notes and that feeling actually mean, a lotus? Maybe, but it's a good way to keep the audience focused on the music. And so that's why for me titles are important, but don't I'm not necessarily telling a real story
Right.
that you could then write down.
Right.
So there's a kind of funny dichotomy there, because the score implies a story. I actually, at one point in the score, I say the eagle enters. So there
Hmm.
are almost dramatic indications in the score, but in the end, that's still just guiding even the musician to give the music a certain feeling.
Right.
But am I actually depicting something? No. Music doesn't really depict very well. Even the Western pieces that are about the Moldau or about whatever, are they really about that? No, that was just the inspiration, right? So it's just a way for us all to share the music, and that's why those things are important to me, because it's all about sharing this wonderful omnicultural world that we live in.
Exactly. That's why I thought it's so important to speak with you about it, because it's from the source. Basically, I'm not making up any story behind it, and I think people would like to understand more about like your thinking, your thought process in writing this piece. And it's so interesting again to be able to speak with you, you know, directly about your work. So, do you have any advice for young composers that may want to try to write for instruments of other cultures?
Well, more or less, the story I've already told pretty well sums it up. Get to know the instruments really well.
Mm-hmm.
Get to know the culture as well as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and don't worry too much about that trajectory. Be serious about it, but as a creative person, you should start creating and processing your learning through your creations as early as possible. Don't worry too much about it. When I started doing this, I made several pieces that were very Western in concept.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll remember a famous moment with May where I had written out, I had controlled how she's going to bend the string. I had written a very Western score with complex, 11/7 or some very complex looking rhythm, and she didn't know how to read it. And then I demonstrated it to her on the jung, and she said, "Oh, that's easy." And I realized, aha, let's not write it the complex way. Let's write it a simpler way that immediately communicates how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So one of the things that you have to be open to as a composer working for intercultural forces is you have to be willing to quickly abandon preconceptions you already have or things you've already learned, and adjust and listen to the musicians and listen to how they do things. Listen to them perform music in their own tradition, ask them how they think about it,
Right.
and so on. To just really get to know how they do best what they do. And then try to write in such a way that you can bring out the best in the musician.
Right.
So this really, it goes directly contrary to the Beethoven damn his fiddle type of comment. You aren't the composer genius unless you already know about the instruments as much as all those instrumentalists you're writing for. So then you can call yourself a genius, but it's not about you as the composer. Really. You are the vessel, and if you train yourself well enough, you will be a good vessel for this kind of music. But be humble and work hard to understand as much as you can about the forces, the instruments, and the cultures that you are mixing it up with.
Right. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Do you have any upcoming works that you're working on that we can check out?
Well, if you're in Taipei on December 11th, you will hear a work for 6 instruments that has been commissioned by Dr. Chen, who is the conductor of the little giant Chinese chamber orchestra.
Right.
He's commissioned a work for 4 Chinese instruments, the diz, the sheng, the pipa, zhong, and then 2 Western instruments, violin and clarinet.
Oh.
It's a very interesting combination.
Right.
And I'm creating small miniatures. The piece will probably last 15 to 20 minutes. I'm creating small miniatures that are about song length, and each one of them is like a little short poem, you could say, in which you hear the character of the instruments in their very characteristic mode. So each instrument is playing in their own idiom. So the violin and the clarinet, for example, are not playing any kind of subservient role or dominant role unless in the piece that they're playing they are taking a more of a lead role, but they are remaining Western instruments and not trying to be anything other than what they are. And the Chinese instruments are being themselves. Everybody's being themselves.
Great.
In the piece. So it creates this wonderful hybrid where, for example, in the first movement, you have a floating solo on xiao, and it's accompanied by these staccato notes on violin.
Right.
And each of these 2 instruments is creating a music together where it is a whole. It sounds entirely integrated, but they are somehow in their own universes, doing 2 different things that match together perfectly. and create a magical world. So this is going to be this is going to be like a chamber piece now 14 years later after Eagle Flies.
Wow.
That will sound quite different.
Right.
Your Connections, obviously, it's the same composer,
Yeah.
but it is kind of a bookend to Eagle Flies. So if you're in Taipei, December 11th is the concert, and hopefully Dr. Chen will come and conduct the piece in Canada. It's likely he will, so we'll keep you updated on that.
That's great. And where can people find your music? Your website.
Website, johnolivermusic.com.
Great. Well, thanks so much for spending all this time talking to us about your piece and your background and advice for young composers. I hope to be able to connect again with you sometime, and I hope to be able to hear more of your music.
Well, thank you so much, Patty. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today.
Great. So we'll talk another time then.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.